Okay, thank you all very much for joining today's session. We'll be having Teresa Berner and Madeline Betts present today's session. I believe Carmen is not able to make it, but he was the lead investigator in this version of the study entitled Scoping Review, Investigation of Complex Rehab Technology and Next Steps. And I will let the presenters introduce themselves. Thank you.
Thanks. Again, welcome to the session. Carmen is not able to be here with us today, but he was a huge participation in this. Rich is in the background. I think they're letting the ladies run the show today. So you have Madeline and myself who are going to share with you where we're at with the scoping review and what next steps are. Thanks, Maddie. You can go ahead and flip. So the contents of this presentation were developed under a grant from NIDAR. So the information of the grant is up there, and the contents don't necessarily represent policy of NIDAR. This is all pretty common to you guys. We just need to let you know the financial disclosure. Next slide. Maddie, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Madeline. I am a student in the Masters of Rehabilitation Technology program at the University of Pittsburgh. And I recently took my ATP exam and a candidate for the ATP. But yeah, thanks for joining us today.
So next slide. So objectives for this session are to identify 2 steps of the CRT scoping review process, list 2 themes that are extracted from the scoping review process, and then list 2 stakeholder groups that were involved in the CRT service delivery. Next slide. The project background, there's 4 sections to the project, and R1 is a scoping review discovery that we're going to talk about. If you stick around for the next session, you will hear Melissa and her team talk about the Seating Mobility Index as an assessment classification protocol for CRT. There's a 3rd section that is analysis of data sets and registries related to CRT. And then a 4th subsection is the development and feasibility of a new CRT policy model with an accountable and value-based framework that has not started yet. But that's kind of the big project, and we're going to be focusing on R1. Next slide. So this talks about the stakeholders. When you see stakeholder, depending on where you're at, you may view stakeholders as very different. But for the purpose of this project, we always start with the consumer as our front and center. You may be a clinician, you may be a supplier, you may be a manufacturer, you may be a payer, and you may be a policymaker. You may have shifted within these bubbles to a clinician may become a supplier, et cetera. But when we use the word stakeholders, this is who we refer to. Next slide. We'd like to start with defining evidence-based practice, just because we recognize there's a wide variability of people. We hope that we're bringing new people into this field of complex rehab. And we want to make sure that everyone understands that defining evidence can be the towers on the left, so it can be client evidence. Obviously, research evidence is what we think about. Professional expertise is also evidence-based practice. Somebody that's been doing this for a long time with repeated outcomes and has that knowledge base is definitely a type of evidence-based practice. The integration and synthesis is a big part of it, and then that helps us with clinical decision-making. If you look to the right, we always like to think that there's an overlap of your professional expertise, your research, and your client evidence, and the overlap helps us with the clinical decision-making. Next slide. So clearly what evidence-based practice is conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of the current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. Sometimes questions about therapy don't require randomized trials, so they can't wait for trials to be conducted. I think a lot of what we do in complex rehab, we just didn't have a lot of evidence to support us in the past, and that's definitely changing. If a randomized trial has not been carried out due to a certain predicament, we must follow the trail. So what we've done early, I would say at least in my career, is we really had to depend on clinical expertise until the research could catch up. We have a lot of really good researchers that are doing a lot of hard work out in the field. And now we're trying to kind of pull in to see what do we know, where the gaps are. The best evidence doesn't always negate lower levels of evidence, and we have to use the information that applies to us in this specific industry. So the next slide talks about two approaches. Oops, sorry, got ahead of myself. So different, where you can find the evidence can be, as I've said, the clinical experience. We heard earlier today about, letters of approval or letters of denial. We have, definitely the clinical expertise that I don't want to underestimate. The published research papers is where we always go to for peer-reviewed journals, such as Archives of Physical Medicine. But sometimes there can be information that's published in a magazine article, like a PT magazine, or various different trade organizations. Conference proceedings are a really good way of looking for evidence. There may be a report of a study that may not have gotten published. And then textbooks is another place we can go to. We all know textbooks sometimes get quickly outdated for the amount of time it takes to get something to be published. But these are all different places you can look for evidence-based practice. So now the next slide, we'll talk about different approaches. I've been introduced to the scoping review process the past several years, and I found it really validating and achievable. So scope and review deals with a less explicit problem, and it may include multiple study designs, and it has broad inclusion for required evidence of varied quality. Systematic review is another approach. It's much more rigorous. It's more specific. It's a well-defined question. It has a predefined study inclusion, and it has rigorous scrutiny to the study quality. So these are just two different approaches. And what we took, the approach was for scoping review. So the next slide. So we chose the scoping review because it's where the research is on the subject. Does the evidence warrant a systematic review? We didn't think we were there yet. And we were able to look at the gaps in the current literature on a topic, and we use it to summarize and disseminate the available research. So I'm going to pass it to Maddie to talk about what the steps are for conducting a scoping review so that she can help you understand what it takes.
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, so we used a couple of different frameworks for organizing, conducting the scoping review and organizing the results of it. So the primary framework we use is the 6-step process. It includes identifying the research question, identifying relevant studies, selecting the studies you want to pay attention to, and then extracting and charting the data, summarizing and reporting those results, and then consulting with subject matter experts to validate what we find. We also use the PRISMA SCR checklist, which is just another way of organizing the results. And this stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses Scoping Reviews Extension. We used covenants to organize each stage of our scoping review. This is a really great resource, and it allows people to work collaboratively together. How this kind of works is you can upload results from your database searches like PubMed and kind of go through each step of the review process. So we first did a title and abstract screening and just looking at what is in that abstract to give us information. We then narrowed down our pool of articles even more and located and uploaded full text articles, and then went through the full text and reviewing our articles more in depth. And then finally, we did a really in-depth data extraction. So we're reading everything, wanting to gather certain pieces of information. And Covenants just allows us to be very thorough in the way that we review this, and multiple people can collaborate on it. So highly recommend using this for any sort of literature review, systematic review, scoping review. It's a very helpful tool, and I've used it in some of my classes also. So the aims of our project specifically and how it fits into this scoping review framework is we want to identify and describe the barriers and facilitators to current complex rehabilitation technology policy. We want to look at the health and disability policy recommendations based on input from stakeholder groups, both nationally here in the US and internationally. And then we're working on creating a summary paper and hopefully getting that published to disseminate the information that we found. So kind of breaking down each step of the scoping review, like Teresa said, the scoping review is a lot more broad in nature. And so our research question, what is the CRT service delivery process for individuals with a disability that have a mobility impairment, is really broad in the sense that we want to gather anything and everything that's in the formal literature to kind of attempt to answer this question. So yeah, looking at the population, the concept, and the context in creating this research question. We worked really closely with an awesome librarian from OSU, Anna, who helped us go through this process of identifying keywords. So different wheeled mobility device applications, different service delivery and policy and insurances. What are the guidelines for these standards? We had a rigorous set of inclusion and exclusion criteria. We're prioritizing peer-reviewed sources as opposed to gray literature like magazine articles and conference proceedings. We really loved reading through those and found them valuable, but decided to focus our attention on these peer-reviewed sources. And then in the event that we came upon like a systematic review or a literature review, we went through and did a hand search of the references to find like the primary sources. So this is a flow chart of kind of each stage of the scoping review. We started out with about 3,000 articles that we did an initial title and abstract screening. And through each step, we narrowed it down to 56 articles for the in-depth data extraction. And here are some of the reasons for excluding the articles. Some of the most common ones where they weren't specifically about service delivery or they were about assistive technology more broadly than just wheeled mobility devices. So some of the information we gathered from the articles in the scoping review fell into a couple different categories. So we wanted to look at what's the geographic region these articles are based on. About half were written and focused in the US, about 20% in the UK. And what was really cool to see is there was at least one representative article each from Europe, South America, South Asia, Africa, and Oceania. So it was really cool to see a diverse perspective in different clinical and funding environments and how their service delivery practices work in those environments. Looking at different funding sources and kind of based on geographic region. Here in the US, we obviously have Medicare, Medicaid, the Veterans Health Administration, and then the Office of Vocational Rehab. In the UK, we focused on the National Health Service and a lot of great articles from Ireland and Britain. And then in kind of sort these international settings, a lot of their funding sources and kind of supplier roles were from local charities or church organizations or non-governmental organizations. So it was just interesting to see how these related and were different from each other. Most of our studies were of a descriptive study design. We had only one quasi-experimental design and just something to take into consideration as we are working through developing evidence-based practice in the CRT world. And then we also had, we wanted to look at the different categories of population descriptions and the perspectives from each one. So we had the consumer, the CRT user, the family member, and their perspectives on the service delivery process. And then we had the clinician, the PT, OT, physician, and then also the ATP supplier role and what their role and perspective is on the service delivery process. And then also viewpoints from the policymaker or the payer. So this is a web of all of the themes that we identified from our 56 articles. The four major themes that we identified were wheeled mobility device, policy, consumer, and service delivery. And then kind of branching off from each of these four main themes are related sub-themes. But what was really cool to see in the results is how interconnected all of these are. You know, there are so many different things that go into each step of the service delivery process. So looking at this visually and seeing how everything is interconnected was really great too. I pulled a couple of articles for each of the major themes from our 56 and just wanted to highlight kind of this interconnectedness with each of them. This first article was based in the UK and had the themes of funding, policy, and standards. BOSS 2006 with the primary theme of consumer, they looked at what are the professional roles, the PT and the OT, what are education and training opportunities, what is the policy set in place, and this one's here in the US. So this is just a taste of some of the articles that we looked at and how diverse the perspectives are for these. So the big things that we wanted to identify from this scoping review are the barriers and facilitators to current service delivery practices for CRT. So some of the really common barriers that we observed are that policies and regulations are unclear. There's a lot of ambiguity in how policies are interpreted and what features and functions are covered in different states, under different insurances. Particularly here in the US. Another big thing we saw was the lack of specialized professional expertise. Clinicians in a variety of roles kind of outside of the CRT world, not knowing what it takes, what's the process for getting their patient a wheeled mobility device. And it's definitely something we can work on in the future. And then long wait times, I'm sure everyone has experienced this, kind of every step of that wheelchair service provision process, from referral to assessment to trialing devices, waiting for funding, getting that ordered. It's taking a long time, and that's impacting the quality of care for our consumers. And then this is more Medicare focused, but diagnosis-driven insurance coding and in-the-home restriction. This kind of just goes along with the restrictive policies set in place, and that there are more things for people to do that's outside of their home and that is different than their formal diagnosis. So some facilitators to optimal service delivery practices is the growing commonality of using evidence-based practice to support new policy development. I think there's been a lot of talk so far in the past couple of days about evidence-based practice, and it's shown in the literature that this is helping facilitate good practice when it comes to CRT service delivery. And then along with this, there's improvement in education and training opportunities, not only for the clinician or the professional, but for consumers and their family members and their caregivers and clinicians and everyone in that wheel of stakeholders. And so that education is really important as we move forward. So it's just some overall clinical implications. We consulted with some internal subject matter experts of our larger research project, primarily physical therapists and occupational therapists, that these barriers and facilitators that we identified in the literature are clinically relevant. They face they experience these challenges every day, and kind of really made clear that the greatest challenge is the lack of professional training, particularly in therapists and other clinicians entering the industry and working on that as a whole. And then for those clinicians that are experienced, have decades under the belt, know what they're doing, have all of this great experience, are still restricted in being able to appropriately meet their client needs due to current policy and the difficulties with documentation and clinician burnout and all of those kinds of things. So just quickly, some limitations with our studies were that we prioritize peer-reviewed sources over gray literature like conference proceedings, but still keeping information from those conference proceedings in mind as like a background support. We didn't find, or I'm sorry, there were a lot of descriptive study designs, and kind of along with this theme of evidence-based practice, the gold standard of evidence-based practice is, the randomized controlled trial. Well, given the nature of our complex populations that we work with, that's not really always an option for us. So continuing to prioritize ways to collect data to support those evidence-based practice. And another thing that we wanted to highlight was that we are looking at an international setting, and there is variability in search terms across different clinical and funding environments. Like not every country or health system uses complex rehabilitation technology. And so just keeping that in consideration and looking at that in future research opportunities. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to Teresa, who's going to talk about consultation in our survey.
Thanks, Maddie. Very nice job. So if we just kind of pause with going back to that scoping review, we identified the research question, we identified studies, we selected them, we charted the data, we collected it. And now that sixth step is that consultation. That's where we reach out to the experts in looking at, have we missed anything? So the survey, we developed a survey, and the survey goals were to validate the scoping review findings and identify missing areas. So this is where all of you have an opportunity to give us that feedback to see, were we on the right track? Was the literature on the right track? Were there areas that were missing? And it's really going to give us that stakeholder opinion of wheelchair service and funding. It's going to help us identify benefits and shortcomings of the policies in the US as well as globally. How we developed it, it was identified from themes from the scoping review to create the specific survey questions. We reviewed by 5 subject matter experts on the scoping discovery review team. And then we had a secondary review by 20 additional seating mobility experts on the project team to verify the relevance and clarity of the questions. And then we did a 3rd level review by seating mobility experts external to the process. So we have advisory groups, and we made sure that we were rigorous enough to make sure we had very focused questions that can loop back to us. So the next slide will show the survey implementation. So what we did was, if you go back to the different stakeholders, we distributed the surveys to consumer groups such as PVA or United Spinal. We distributed to professional groups like NERTS and Clinician Task Force. Well, the survey is open till the end of February. So if you have not had a chance to take the survey, please save this link. And I think we're going to put it in the chat also so that you can fill it out later. The next slide will show you what we have so far. So we do have responses from suppliers, consumers. We have responses from everybody, but you can see suppliers, consumer, caregivers, and clinicians are the largest group. I'm really surprised that we didn't have a higher response from the manufacturers, because we sent it out to every single manufacturer. I was lucky enough to kind of coordinate some of the distribution. My only thought is maybe some people didn't think that they should take it, because initially some of the conversation was, well, I'll give it to our educators. No, we want everybody. We want everybody to take it. You can see payers. We only have, at the time this was printed, because we've been getting surveys continually coming in, we have a very low group from the payer. So if anyone on here is a manufacturer, works with manufacturers or payers, we really would like to get more response from those 2 groups. And we'll continue to get the response from the clinician, consumer, supplier. I was really happy for the consumer group, because it was hard to disseminate the information, but it shows that we've had a really good response rate. And the responses are not only from the US, but they are international. So thanks to those of you that have helped us disseminate the surveys, and just continue to plug away so we can get more data. It'll be open till the end of February. So the next slide talks about one of the projects that came out of it, which is a quality assurance. These are really exciting projects, and I'm going to pass it back to Maddie to talk about it.
Yeah, so we have a couple of different sub-projects within our larger CRT service delivery scoping review project. One of them is the quality assurance reporting. So this, the goal of this is to look retrospectively analyze FMA UDS information and identify reasons why a client is listed as not active, why their status is not active. The FMA is a patient reported outcome, and it assesses the satisfaction, the client satisfaction with mobility related activities of daily living. The purpose is to, kind of figure out at what stages in the service delivery process and why and what we can do better to make sure that we keep in contact with these clients. So for after the assessment and before the mobility device was delivered, The top reasons why someone was listed as not active was that the device was not delivered. The provider is no longer participating in the FMA, and this was primarily due to the provider no longer being a VGM member. There were issues getting the equipment funded. There was no new equipment, and this goes along with like repairs or modifications that needed to be made. Loss in contact with the client overall, or the client had died. After the device was delivered, some of the reasons why their status was listed as not active was loss in contact. Again, the provider no longer participating in the FMA. Other, which was kind of a whole host of things, including the wrong form was included. The client was in hospice or in a skilled nursing facility. There was issues with environmental accessibility in their home. And then kind of these last three reasons: the client opted out, the client was deceased, or the equipment was returned for whatever reason. And just the overall goal of this project is to find out how we as clinicians and providers are able to adjust their approach to reaching clients and making sure that they recognize the benefit for themselves and kind of the industry as a whole to collect data through each part of the service delivery process and measure their satisfaction. And, you know, checking in with them and improving our quality of care is always very important to us. And so just figuring out what it is that we can do to help facilitate this process.
And we hope to have a paper out on that. That was a really exciting. You know, that's why they asked me to do the panel on big data. So I get excited with this data. You know, all these people that are just lost. And so we spend so much time getting them started, and why aren't we able to help them carry out with the equipment? And so I'm sorry, Maddie, they did a really good job diving into this sub project. And this is everybody that was in the entire UDS database. So this, look for more on this topic.
Yeah, we're working on publishing this eventually, so keep your eyes out. And then our second sub-project, we're looking at the specific policy language within different health insurance companies and within Medicare and Medicaid. We're just looking at the US as of now with, I think, intentions to expand, but just looking at the provision processes, is maintenance and repair covered in this policy language, and overall their process. We looked at Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance companies like United Healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Anthem, and then also Veterans Health Administration policies and how those all are related and different. And kind of some of the common themes that we have observed so far is that Medicare's guidelines are used to either replicated or used pretty heavily to inform private insurance companies policy, and with the in the home restriction, diagnosis driven coding, all of that is very similar state to state with Medicaid and in different health insurances. The ways that the VA is different is that functional capacity and quality of life is maybe considered more or in addition to medical diagnosis. And there is no in the home restriction for the VA. So this is just a preliminary look at policy language, and is something that we're going to look at further, looking at the definitions of medical necessity and what's covered, and figuring out maybe why there is so much ambiguity in how policies are interpreted. So kind of just a quick overall summary, barriers to current service delivery practices as seen in the literature is that policy is restrictive, and the ways that the policy is written prevent consumers in getting what they need in a timely manner. Some things that are going really well and are continuing to go well for the industry and the CRT service delivery process is the expanded use of and implementation of evidence-based practice, and then expanding training opportunities for everyone in that stakeholder wheel, consumers first and foremost, but also clinicians and payers and everyone. Some overall opportunities for growth is that we as an industry can continue to support our subject matter experts in whatever field that is to continue to publish in peer-reviewed journal articles. Kind of anecdotally, and this is what we're hoping to, or one of the things we're hoping to see after analyzing the survey results, is that things that clinicians might experience in everyday practice, and this is an issue, we're not seeing it in the literature. And so we need to be able to facilitate and support our colleagues in publishing in peer-reviewed journal articles so that we can further continue that that evidence-based practice approach and use data and evidence to support the development of new policy. So in terms of next steps, we're working on disseminating a lot of these different findings and then doing an analysis of the survey results after February, and then inform some of these internal projects within our larger research project, which Teresa will go a little bit more in depth. So,
thank you. So if you remember the subgroup, so the R2, which is a seating mobility index, they are presenting right after us. They are the IC83. And so if you want to learn more about that, I think the clinicians will really appreciate the depth that we went into on that. The 5 aims that they have are to review and evaluate existing classification systems, gather and assess the standardized and validated tools. So they looked at assessing body structures, function, activity, participation, person and environmental context. And then they use the ICF framework for aim 1 and 2 to develop the seating mobility index. Aim 4 is to look at initial clinometric assessment of the seating mobility index and then correlate the scores with levels of CRT intervention. So we haven't finished all 5 aims, and we can get you updated if you either listen to the next one or listen to the recording. The next slide shows R3. So this is the analysis of data sets and registries. So the 5 aims that are up there is looking at assessing, categorizing, and catalog variables of interest in each data set, determine what common variables have similarly in distribution of the characteristics. They're looking at assessing single or combination data sets to determine average reasonable useful life, so the RUL, of the different CRT types, as well as types and frequency of repairs. The 4th aim is to look at the relationship between the age of the device and distance in relation to the amount and frequency of service messages, and then go on to aim 5 to look at the to identify a common uniform data set for CRT registry. So they're in the process of working on R3. And then R4, as I said, is we haven't started this yet. So this is the development of a new CRT policy model. And so we hope to establish elements and attributes of a new CRT model based on assessments of other models, the stakeholder consensus, which is the R1. So we really need you to do the survey. Documentation strategies, which is the R2, which is the seating mobility index, and there'll be a survey coming up on that, and we'll integrate the data analytics from the R3. So based on stakeholder input, we are hoping to develop and describe a new CRT policy model and the core attributes in relation to a value-based care approach. We hope to do a feasibility analysis of the new policy manual model compared to the current model, focused primarily on time and resource burdens. I think that's a big one that we all feel. We feel that time and resource burden, and we hope to, what the proposed new model comes up with, be able to really compare it to what we have now. And then perform a cost-benefit analysis of outcomes between the models. Super exciting for the end of the day of a Tuesday. So when you go back to implementation science, we're really from a framework concept, we're at the precondition phase. So implementation science is a big buzz term right now. And the framework to connect evidence, professional expertise, client evidence into regular practice, so the quality and effectiveness of health services can be improved. We're just at the beginning, and we're really excited to have this information and to share. And there is a CRT policy. If you go to the next slide, if you want to get additional information, about the grant and the great team who was involved. We're really, Madeline and I are just honored to be able to represent all the work that everyone did, but it's definitely a team of experts. And check out the website, and then there's the survey link. And then the IC83 is what I referred to a little bit earlier about the Seating Mobility Index with Rachel, Dr. Rodriguez, Julie, and Melissa. I'm excited to have that information disseminated. So that is what we had. And the next slide is time for questions. And then we have references at the end. So we'll pause now. What thoughts does everyone have?
Okay, I see a few questions in the chat. Maybe thoughts on pitfalls and funding to exploit potential new CRT proposals by Matt. I don't know if you can see the questions.
Pitfalls that funders will exploit from potential new CRT policy. Yep. Matt, why do you always have to ask that's my guy from Ohio State. So I'm going to invite Rich or Mark to help on that one. I mean, we haven't had a lot of funding feedback on the stakeholder group. And when we're looking at our potential new policy, we're prepared to have the evidence and have the research so that there's not a way that they're going to be able to push back, even though we know historically there's been a lot of pushback based on the illogic and not common sense that has been living out there. Maddie, did you have any thoughts about Matt's concern about funders exploiting potential new policies?
No, I think that's great, Teresa.
Rich or Mark? Carmen's not here for me to pick on. I think the important thing is we're going about this through a very rigorous process, and we're preparing ourselves to have the evidence and have data that's available to us so that we're not just going to make up a policy that is a feel-good policy. We're going at it very constructively in a way that we hope is well received and is a solution that's going to benefit everybody, not just one group over the other. So someone else thinks this is exciting on a Tuesday afternoon. Thank you.
I hope everyone's not asleep, but because we're presenting R2 next.
That's right.
Hey, Teresa, I was just going to jump on this way rather than typing, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I guess my frame, or as you're moving into that, I'm going to call it that R4 section. Moving forward with, okay, how are we going to structure this, our ideas and our goals of all of this coming out of it? I guess, is there a little kind of quorum? Is there a consumer-based group or clinician-based task force or manufacturer-based task force that is going to try and see what could issues be with
okay?
Because we all know that insurances, and I'm just going to say funders, they will always find loopholes. They will always find those ways to nitpick us. They will always find those ways to make our lives harder.
Yeah, we do have advisory groups and stakeholder groups, and that's what we were referring to earlier when we're going through the rigor of the survey with the consultation. So we have subject matter experts and consumer advisory groups and professional advisory groups that were reflecting each of these steps back to get some input. So is that what you mean? Like who is our kind of first level to filter it before we go straight to a policy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a ton of work going into this. So it's kind of like, can the group that is doing so much work for this, can they make sure that all perspectives are covered so that 2 years down the line, they're not like, oh, why didn't we potentially think of this? Even from the perspective when they took away funding for an upgrade for a titanium frame, for example, that kind of really took the legs out of half the industry with the manual chair. And that's just one example. And obviously I know that we've learned from that. But I'm glad to hear that there's some stakeholders in it to really push some of that, just so we can potentially
Yeah.
try and be ahead of them rather than reacting to them because we know they're crafty.
Right, and that's a great question. I'm glad that you brought it up. And Rachel reminded me that R4 also includes an actual payer to test the policy. So it's definitely well thought out, and I'm sorry that we didn't explain that. That's good feedback for us to explain kind of some of the different advisory groups that we have outside of this specific team.
Okay, feel free to unmute yourself if you have other questions.
Yeah.
We'll give it a couple more minutes.
And again, just to echo, there's multiple universities, multiple academic assistive technology centers, and then there's clinicians and real clients to test it out. Okay, well, I appreciate everybody's help and interest, and definitely if you can't listen right away, go to the recording for the Seating Mobility Index, because we definitely want input and help. So the code, Melissa, do you have the code?
I'm typing it in right now. 6KS 6YX.
You got it. So 6K, S is in Sam, 6YX. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your support and collaboration.
Yep, thank you. Good job, Maddie.
Thank you.